always with a focus on recovery. And tonight we're talking about the Oxford House model. And joining us in the studio tonight will be a number of people. We're going to be talking to Myrna Brown. She opened the first Washington Oxford House some years ago. She was on the Oxford House World Council. Tony Perkins will also be in the studio. He is the Washington State Association of Oxford Houses incarceration chairman. And then Mitch Likens, who has been on the program before. He is the Washington State Association of Oxford Houses treasurer. Talking about the whole Oxford House model. And joining us in this first segment is Leonard Jason. Dr. Jason is one of 4 editors of a brand new book from Hayworth Press. It's an exceptional book called Creating Communities for Addiction Recovery, the Oxford House Model. And Dr. Jason is a professor of psychology at DePaul University in Chicago, where he heads the Center for Community Research. Dr. Jason, thank you so much for joining us tonight on Recovery Coast to Coast.
Happy to join you.
Give us a little overview, if you would, first of all, for our listeners, in terms of the Oxford House model.
Sure. There's about 1,200 of these houses. Each of them are independent, and they're rented. And there's houses for men, there's houses for women, some houses for women and children, for men and children. And basically, there's just a few rules. You have to not take any alcohol or drugs, and if you do, you're immediately asked to leave. You have to pay your rent, which is very modest given that there's 7 or 8 or 9 people that are living in the house. And you have to not engage in disruptive behaviors. And if you can basically live as part of this house, once you come into the house and are voted in, and the majority of people have to vote you in just like any family, you can stay in this house for the rest of your life. And that's a very different type model where basically you can live there not just for a certain period of time, like 6 months or a year, but you can live there as long as you want. And the other critical factor is that it's completely self-run, that there are no professionals, that the people who are running the house are the members of the house. They elect their own officers. They self-govern completely.
Now, you mentioned the fact that this is not really transitional living, but it certainly is open-ended. Any idea of what percentage of people actually stay indefinitely as opposed to those who may look at this as a transitional model of maybe 3-6 months and then move on with their lives?
The average stay that we found in some of our research, and we had 2 large projects funded by the National Institutes of Health, and one involved about 1,000 people that we called every 4 months, and the other involved the randomized trial where we had people coming out of recovery, different types of treatment centers, and then they either went into an Oxford House or the usual aftercare, and we followed them for 2 years. And those 2 different samples, generally what we found was that people spent about a year in these houses, but again, it varies. Some people have spent years and years in the houses, 10, 15 years. Other people come in and they just spend, a couple weeks.
Do people move around at all? I mean, do people move from house to house, or pretty much that is their house, that is their home, really?
Exactly. The people generally stay in the house, but that doesn't mean that a person might kind of apply for another house and move to another one. That certainly can happen. Sometimes a person's in an Oxford house and they relapse and they end up having to leave, and then sometimes they come back into an Oxford house, and sometimes they'll try to get into a new house just so that they can get a different experience.
Now, what happens when someone does relapse and is forced to leave? Where do they go? Is there any transition, or are they just told, hey, pack your bags, you're out?
Yeah, it is kind of a tough love approach, and I think that's one of the powerful sense of responsibility. You have to basically be in charge of this recovery process. And in a sense, if you drink or take drugs, you can't be in an Oxford house because, everybody else is clean. So it's a very strong model. And I just might add that in the book and in some of our publications, what we have indicated is that if you go into these houses and you stay there for at least 6 months, you have a very good chance of basically staying clean. We generally think that 6 months is the critical period of time. And those folks who come into the house and stay at least 6 months, about 85% of them are drug-free 2 years later.
What is the recovery requirement to get in? How much sobriety or recovery do you need to get into an Oxford house?
Probably varies by different houses, different regions. But, clearly the more time you have that you have without taking alcohol or drugs, the better. But generally you can get into a house as long as you say to them, you're not taking drugs now, you're clean, and you want to be in an environment that's going to support your sobriety. And that's the critical thing. I mean, when they interview you and the House members, they're saying, how deep is your firm conviction that you want to be in an abstinence setting? And if you basically say that this is the turning point, that you've hit bottom, and you now want to change your life, they will really listen to that message.
We are visiting with Dr. Leonard Jason, professor of psychology at DePaul University in Chicago. He heads up the Center for Community Research, and he is one of the authors, one of the editors of a brand new publication from Hayworth Press. It's a great book called Creating Communities for Addiction Recovery, the Oxford House Model. And I know one of the articles that you have edited in this particular publication has to do with communities. And, you know, we all look at the NIMBYs, the people who, you know, not in my backyard. They don't want alcoholics and addicts in their backyard. How do you deal with that situation in communities where a house becomes a place where recovering addicts and alcoholics live?
Well, you know, people call me from different parts of the country, and they ask me, you know, how do I feel about, you know, a house moving onto their block? And what I generally tell them is that it's going to be very strong, positive role models for everybody in that block. We've done actually a study where we took Oxford houses in the state of Illinois, and we interviewed people living right next to the Oxford house, and then we interviewed people kind of that weren't that close to the Oxford house. And what we found was that the more you know about these people, these citizens who are trying to transform their lives, the more you know them, the more you're close to them, the more you feel comfortable with the recovery home, and you really like them and the people and the process of recovery. So in a sense, you know, really the best message about this Oxford House system is that it works, that people who live close to it and really get to know the people really feel that they're an inspiring group of people on their block, and they really help transform that block to a place where differences are valued.
People in recovery certainly are good, solid citizens. Let's talk about gender and race, and start with gender in terms of, are these houses mixed male and female, or are they female only and male only?
Yeah, female only and male only, and it does turn out that there are more men's houses than women's houses. And in addition, you know, in terms of income, it does look like people who come into an Oxford house seem to be making about $1,000 a month, which is really helping you start getting out of poverty. The individuals who go to the usual care who don't get an Oxford house are making half that. So just think about it. If you're making about $500, $400 a month, you're in poverty. But if you're making $1,000 and you're living with a group of people that are supporting you and helping you stay employed, because the people in Oxford House are employed because they're paying their rent, it makes a huge difference. Now, between the males and the females, it does turn out the males make a little bit more than the females.
Now, as far as women are concerned, what about pregnant women or women with children? Obviously, that's one of the realities in terms of when women get sober, they have a lot of responsibility. Many times that includes children.
Yeah, that's a real need. There are houses for women and children. We've actually studied a number of them, and it turns out that when we talk to these houses, they have a sense of community that's higher than about anything we've ever seen. And the really neat thing about it is the kids in the house have multiple parents. And just think about the transforming preventive sense of kids who have often had a very chaotic life and very difficult type of circumstances with parents who are drug and alcohol using, coming into an environment that's completely abstinent, where basically people are caring about them. It's not just their parents, but it's also other house members. It's something that actually our next grant proposal that we've submitted to National Institutes of Health is to try to understand kind of what happens to these kids in these houses. It's a fascinating story. We just have kind of glimpses of it, but we think it's some very, very positive, preventive things are happening in these young people's lives.
How do you address the medical needs of people who are in these homes?
Well, there are no treatments that are actually offered in an Oxford house. So one of the questions is, you know, when people have medical needs, and certainly quite a few people in an Oxford house after, you know, abusing drugs and alcohol do have some medical problems, they basically need to seek either therapy or counseling or medical treatments outside the house. Of course, they can take, you know, if they're on, you know, physician medications, they can take them in the house. But self-help group meetings and all types of treatments are outside the house. And absolutely, what happens in the houses, which is really, again, a fascinating story and something that we're just beginning to explore, is that if people are beginning to get well and beginning to have a job and beginning to have support for that job and beginning to make a difference in their life and get support for who they are, what really starts happening is they start taking better care of themselves. And people kind of start saying, well, gee, maybe that hepatitis C, I've got to sort of start treating it, or or, the other types of illnesses that they just kind of had and they accepted, they get support for getting treatment. So one of the things that's really interesting is we want to be able to better understand kind of how people's health status changes over time. That's another area of future research we're hoping to do.
The book is based on a 13-year collaborative research partnership, Creating Communities for Addiction Recovery, the Oxford House Model, and we're visiting with Dr. Jason from DePaul University. Let me ask you about other countries. Is this something that's unique to the United States, or is the Oxford Model international in scope?
Well, it has houses in Canada, and there's also houses in Australia. Most of the houses are in the United States. And it's interesting that, in those three countries, there is a strong kind of self-help, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous movement. But we think it's very possible that this particular model could be ripe for countries who sort of really don't have kind of, a lot of services for people with these types of problems. So we'd like nothing better than to see this particular model disseminated in many countries, and actually one of our investigators is interested in studying that process.
How do people wind up going to an Oxford House? Is there a clearinghouse? How do people find out about it? And is it essential to be in a 12-step group?
I would say that people can usually find out about it by if they're in treatment, and their treatment setting has personnel in it who have heard about Oxford House. It's usually word of mouth. They will kind of say, gee, you're just finishing up your treatment. Why don't you go to this particular setting? It'd be very good for you. Sometimes courts mandates where they basically say you really need to be in a recovery home. And if an Oxford House is in that community, remember there's 1,200 of them around the country, that's an easy place to refer people. So that does occur. There's also an Oxford House website, so just do a search on the internet, Google or Yahoo, and put in the terms Oxford House, and you'll find their website. And on the website, it lists all the houses throughout the United States, so you can find if there's an Oxford House in your neighborhood. And
I imagine that there's more and more Oxford Houses springing up as we speak.
Absolutely. This is a phenomena that that the public has seized upon. And the interesting thing is, again, that the really critical thing, you would figure that with, administration that's got so much deficits and so much, red ink, that they would kind of look at this model and they would kind of say, well, gee, this is really interesting. Here you got a group of people who are renting a house, who are basically paying their bills, who are getting a job, who are staying drug-free, and they're doing it on their own. I mean, just think about the power of a model like this. If we were to say maybe something like this could also be helpful for ex-offenders, for people who have psychiatric problems, for people who have all these different problems of homelessness and health-compromised situations. I mean, just think about it. If we had an inexpensive model that works like Oxford House for a dozen other types of problems, think about the national importance that it could be for our country.
And again, just a couple of quick questions here, and then we'll let you go. But it's not essential that you belong to a 12-step group. Is that correct?
That's right. Some of the, each house has slightly different rules, and some of the houses will ask the people to go to some type of program outside the house. Mm-hmm. But it really depends on the house.
Okay, and I guess the last question has to go back again to relapse. If someone relapses in an Oxford setting and they're asked to leave the house, can they return at a future time with some sobriety or recovery behind them?
Yes, and again, it's the same rules. They have to get 80% of the members to kind of accept them into the house. Sometimes when a person relapses, they might want to just try at a different house and come back and sort of say, I messed up there and I want a new fresh start. But yes, people can go back, and again, it's the same process. It's a family, and a family decides who they want to bring in, and a family can exclude. So if you want to be part of the family, you got to follow these basic rules. And what's really neat about it is it's an organic process that has derived a set of rules that actually work. So it's not a bunch of psychologists who've come up with a bunch of theories and tested it out. It's actually based on what works. And that's why me as a community psychologist, I've been so interested in studying this, and with the wonderful cooperation of Paul Malloy and many other people within the Oxford House movement to just try to understand something that works. Isn't it kind of refreshing to actually find something that works as opposed to always studying what doesn't work?
Absolutely. Over 1,200 Oxford houses in the United States. It's a fascinating model. More importantly, it is a successful model. And it is all outlined in this new book from Hayworth Press called Creating Communities for Addiction Recovery, the Oxford House Model. And one of the authors and contributors to this is Dr. Leonard Jason from DePaul University. Dr. Jason, thank you so much for joining us tonight on Recovery Coast to Coast.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to take a short time out. When we come back on the other side, we're going to meet three people from the Oxford House movement. Myrna Brown,